country. I've only worked within the U.S. I think that obviously for our international students, there are some mechanics to that. Matters of OPT and CPT and visas and all of those things. But culturally, one thing that I can say with some degree of confidence is that in the United States versus some other, particularly some European countries, the work of architects is not as visible, it's not as kind of understood as valuable, with the exception of some kind of niche markets here or there. And I say that because you look at the way that, like in Europe, a lot of commissions are competition driven, and the competitions are very public, and you get a lot of public engagement around, what should this park be, or what should this building be, and how do we make it really a kind of civic project. Whereas in the United States, a lot of things are privately developed, and so a developer will come in and acquire a piece of property, and we'll put together what we call a pro forma that says, this mix of land use with this much parking and this much visibility will generate this much profit on paper. And that private developer is usually kind of risk averse and bottom line driven, and is less interested in, typically, now there are some really enlightened developers, but typically are not necessarily worried about the long-term kind of growth of the city and health of the city. They're more interested in, how do I make this project profitable? It's a good time to be looking for employment because the market has kind of moved in a positive direction. I've had a number of folks call over the summer asking for people to hire. We had a really good turnout at studio nights in the spring relative to a couple of years ago when it was pretty sparse, the professional turnout. So the good news is that right now there are a good number of employment opportunities. The question becomes, how do you find the right employment opportunity for you? And in order to be able to define that question, you need to first really be clear about what it is that you want to do in and around the practice of architecture. So there are a ton of people that need somebody that knows how to build Revit models, right? So if you become really Revit proficient, you can find a job. The challenge with that is that it's really kind of a vocation at that point. Starting your own practice is risky because you need capital, you're going to carry overhead, you need to be able to understand business in terms of, how do you get business loans, but more importantly, you need to know, how are you going to get the clientele that you're going to need to essentially support your business. And different architects have gone about starting their own practice in different ways, and to various degrees of success. So if you look at Architecton locally, in the beginning, a lot of the work that they were doing was not terribly critical. They did, fast food venues and other, kind of projects that were very normative, but they started to build enough what I would say kind of bread and butter clients that they knew they could count on to provide a certain amount of revenue, that they could then kind of reach out and do some more critical projects and then really kind of feature those as what they aspire to. So there was like this is what we can do, and then this is what we aspire to do. And one of the big questions that need to be asked is, what, if you start your own practice, what kind of a practice do you want to have? Architecton are interesting. They're kind of what we'd say a mid-sized practice. They're not a big practice. Big practices are increasingly corporate and branch-oriented. So like locally we have a Shepley Bullfinch, we have Smith Group, JJR, but they're headquartered somewhere else, and then there's a branch in Phoenix. And so the other sort of type of practice that we see. There's a mid-sized big practices, or the kind of smaller boutique practices, like say Wendell Burnett's practice. And Wendell, it's tough for him, if you were to be honest, to operate as a small boutique practice, because when things are good, you have to grow very quickly, which is what he's experiencing right now. He's got a good amount of work, he's got some great clients, but he doesn't have enough staff, so he's got to grow quickly. When things are bad, you get really, really lean. In a big firm, you might lose a huge amount of your workforce, but the kind of key folks in the practice are always kind of protected, let's say. In a small firm, you don't have a lot of room to shrink when there's not a lot of work. And so there was a stretch of time when everybody was really struggling, but it was really tough for Wendell. He was really fortunate to have one really big project that kind of was an ongoing project that in a large way kind of carried him through the recession. Not that he didn't have other projects. He did St. Francis during that time. He did Soy 4 during that time. But it was definitely lean. It was tough. It was disconcerting. And there's a practice locally that was also a boutique. And when things got bad and they didn't have work coming in, there was a big question of, is that firm going to continue? And Shepley Bulfinch, or SBRA, Shepley Bulfinch Richardson Architects, who are headquartered out of Boston and who've been growing quite rapidly into a big corporate firm, essentially called Joe and said, we'd like to acquire MERS Project and make you a studio of Shepley Bulfinch. And initially when they acquired them, it was still MERS Project, but MERS Project was kind of a subheading to Shepley Bulfinch. And they were still struggling to really kind of bring in their own clients, so they rapidly just kind of fell under the Shepley Bulfinch brand, and they've grown as a kind of branch. And so that's an instance where a firm that started out with the intention of being a kind of smaller boutique firm, maybe with a more of a mid-sized growth aspiration, had to essentially assimilate into a larger firm in order to continue, because architecture, it's not a very kind of stable market. When the economy is good, you have a ton of projects and you need to kind of ramp up, and when the economy is bad, you don't have very many projects and you have to kind of let people go. And that's one of the biggest kind of challenges for starting your own practice, is how do you understand and kind of adapt with the resources that are available to you. There are the obvious skills, management. There are, let's say, general management skills that are needed to really manage any kind of a workforce, and that gets into, how do you coordinate staff around projects, how do you motivate people, how do you establish culture, all of those things. There is a key kind of ethics and liability side of managing an architecture firm. And I say that particularly with liability. Life safety is a part of architectural design. Architects get sued all the time for errors and omissions typically. And so as an architect, you have to carry what's called E&O insurance, errors and omissions insurance. In order to be licensed, you have to have that. And, or at least in order to practice, you have to have it. And that's a kind of a key kind of growth that all folks that move into management and architectural practice have to really kind of get a handle on, is managing liability. There's also the matter of working with municipalities. Anytime you're working with a client in a municipality, the municipality has all sorts of rules and regulations about what you can and can't do. The client has all sorts of aspirations about what they'd like to do, and you have to work to see if you can align the vision of the client with the regulations of the city and the international code as well, but mostly with the city, and see, are there areas where you can push for a variance from the city, get them to reconsider rules based on the specific needs or interests of the client and the potential benefits of bending that rule in that particular context, because rules are oftentimes kind of just generally applied, right? The other thing is when managing a practice, particularly construction management all the time. And one of the big kind of adjustments is that when you're working on a project that's in construction, the contractor is constantly needing information, is constantly raising questions. So you'll get what are called RFIs, requests for information, that'll come in. It used to be faxes, now it's emails. That'll come in, several line items at a time. That are looking at the drawings and they want to know, what is this? Can we substitute here? There'll be information that they're giving you saying, well, what you specified as a material can't be here for 6 weeks, and that impacts our construction schedule. We think we could get something else in 2 weeks, but you need to approve it, which means then that as a manager of a practice, you have to say, well, you need to submit to me samples of each so that we can review them with the client and say, is this an acceptable substitute, or does it end up looking cheaper or less beautiful or less functional, and we're not willing to make that substitution. There are also, in construction management, what are called change orders, where Disruptive Design Practice Handbook. And it's a book that the author, Cliff Mosier, also wrote several chapters of multiple editions of the Architect's Professional Practice Manual. So the Architect's Professional Practice, working with developers to really kind of establish cultural value, designing organizational structures, designing a whole host of things, using an architect's training, but not narrowly focused on creating buildings at the end of the day. And when I was listening to Lorenzo talk about his firm and what they do, his practice and what they do, it really resonated with this book.